Good, good.
Okay, I'm just going to do a quick little blurb at the beginning. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Santa Monica KTC's Thursday night Sangha. We have Lama Adam with us this evening. Very fortunate to have you here. Thank you for joining us. If there's anybody here that would like to make a donation, please do so. There's a link on our newsletter. There's also, you can go on our website, which is santamonicaktc.com, and you can make a donation there. You can also check out about becoming a member of Santa Monica KTC. So I will give it over to you, Lama Adam, and I'm just going to ask everybody to put their microphones on mute. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Hi, Bruce. Let's dive in with, well, let me do this thing where I figure out if I can share my screen. I think I can. Yeah, let's dive in and do the refuge prayer. So we'll say it once in Tibetan, once in English, and then once in Tibetan. O Sangye Chidang Soki Chodnamna Jangchu Padu Dagni Kyapsuchi Daki Jinso Ki Pe Sunam Ki Drola Penchi Sangye Drupasho. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of accomplishing generosity and the other perfections, may I attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. O Sangye Chidang Suki Chodnama Jangchu Pardu Dagni Kyapsuchi Daki Jinso Ki Pe Sunam Ki Rola Penchi Sangye Drupasho. Aden Savanama Rinpoche Daki Chivo Bedi Tenjula Kajun Jaboko Neche Sunte Usun Tugi Ngudrup Sadhu So. Okay. So as I was saying a little earlier, it's been a kind of a exhausting week, but in a good way. Everything's been going great, but I am as an introvert who just started doing 20 more hours of work a week at a college, an introvert who came out of retreat into a pandemic, into a lot of video work, actually being on a campus with a bunch of very excited young people. It's fantastic, but I'm still adjusting my battery to that kind of a thing. And I usually come home now and I'm like, my chest is like just kind of tight and excited, for like hours after work. And I'm trying to figure out if I can, switch around my exercise schedule, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, that's part of the reason why I'm glad that I'm teaching on what I am right now, because it's stuff that I'm needing to recall more often right now. And I think that I planned this before I knew about this new job, so it's a little fortunate or auspicious maybe. But it reminds me of one of the funnier things I ever heard that Rinpoche said, and it was that I'm going to clean it up from the way I heard it. But when it's time to use the bathroom, it's too late to buy a toilet. And the idea here being, we want to practice and learn these techniques and habituate with these kinds of techniques before we need them, ideally, especially when it comes to things like our practice of meditation. Philosophies and frameworks for thinking about things, those may be helpful in the moment. We may find the right book that kind of hits just right, and that's great. But if we really want our practice to be there, we do want our practice to be there when challenges come along. So I do want to just briefly kind of fly through what we covered last time. But before we do that, let's take a moment and do a little meditation. And I'm going to guide you through this one. So we'll just take a couple deep breaths in and out. Let ourselves come into the room and be present. A lot of what we were talking about and what we're going to be talking about is about balance. Resilience is about toughness, building strength, and resourcing is about finding and utilizing what's nourishing. So there's a level of awareness and a use of the attention and awareness we've been training that comes into play here. And so the first thing I'd like to invite you to do is close your eyes. And we're going to just, with an open awareness, no particular object, we're going to take a moment and self-assess, noticing whether our attention seems to be returning on its own to things outside of us, our environment, sounds in the room, maybe smells, anything external, or does it keep returning internally? Does it keep returning to thoughts, physical sensations, memories, and planning? So we'll just take a minute here, just observe. What we're assessing is whether in this moment our attention is biasing interoceptively inwards or exteroceptively outwards. And using that information, we're going to do a short period of shamatha. And I'd like to suggest that if you feel like your attention has been moving inward, that pull, that gravitational pull keeps coming back internally, I would suggest opening your eyes and finding an object in the room or a spot on the carpet, something external to make your anchor for this short session of shamatha. And if your attention has been moving outwards, biasing exteroceptively, we'll pick an internal anchor. That might be something like the breath or a physical sensation. And the technique is the simple placing our attention on that anchor, noticing when we're distracted, and gently, patiently, and with a little sense of humor, coming back to the anchor repeatedly. And we'll try that for just a couple minutes now. Okay, thank you. Any thoughts or questions on that? That when I first learned that kind of blew my mind in a really good way. I mean, I think there's an implied. Oh yeah, Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah. I never thought before to check in with myself before doing a outer tethering of the mind or an inner tethering of the mind. Yeah. I've just always, well, used to be the outer, the rock, the Buddha statue, or the breath, but I've never thought about that before. And I think it's really good because it's making you become self-aware right from the start rather than just going by a recipe meditation practice.
I ditto all of that. Same here. I mean, it's kind of mind blowing, right? That we hadn't thought to check in with maybe what we are doing or what we're needing from our practice in the moment. And I think that from what I understand, most people tend to bias internally. But I've definitely, as I've been doing this daily now, multiple times a day, there are times when I'm biasing externally. You know, like I was I'm in a new office at work, and I was leading a meditation with someone online today in that office, and was very aware of my environment because I was not used to just being quiet in that room. It was a brand new room to me, and so I went with an internal anchor. And I think what's important to know is there is an aspect of challenge here. So I realized I didn't do what I normally do at the beginning, which is teach that window of tolerance briefly and just remind everyone that if we're really spaced out or really agitated, there's a spectrum there, and between like a 3 and an 8 is a good place to challenge ourselves a little bit. And if we're at either end of the spectrum, we probably need some sort of practice to bring us back into that window before challenging ourselves can be beneficial, and potentially not even risky. So I think that one thing to remember about this internal external is if we are biasing inwardly, that's usually to our thoughts, it's usually to our stories,
Yeah.
and so we can, if we move inward and we put the anchor inward and we're in the midst of maybe like a lot of turmoil in our lives, maybe things are happening that are kind of got those stories playing on repeat, um, that makes it a lot harder, and we can actually cause ourselves some anxiety. I've definitely noticed this, and since I've been working with this, I've talked to people like in this exact situation. They're like, I keep meditating and I can't, I just can't get over these stories, but they're using an inward anchor, and if they switch to something external, they're able to restore some balance to the force.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Hmm.
So in one hand, in one sense, we could say that going with your bias would be the comfortable thing, but that's not really true. Like we're actually, if we do that, we may be, kind of just reinforcing what's already an imbalance. So really, we probably want to go with the opposite if we're in that window of tolerance where we feel like we can do a more challenging practice like shamatha, which is relatively challenging.
Yeah.
So just to quickly review what we talked about last time before I introduce something new. Oh, there it is. So this is the window of tolerance we talked about last time. As always, we're always welcome to shift your posture, do your own practice, engage in whatever self-care you need to. This is the theme, right? Being aware of ourselves and what we need in the moment. Recalling that while we're on this path to Buddhahood, we also need to be aware of our limitations and where we're at in the moment. And when we need the resource, take care of ourselves so that we can continue on the path. So that's really the theme here. And the main thing we talked about was this learning zone diagram. We talked about how we usually feel happy when we're in our comfort zone. We tend to feel a little disgruntled when we're in our learning zone. Learning zone being a place where we're not actually comfortable anymore, but we're still definitely safe. We're safe to push ourselves and challenge ourselves. And that's a good zone to be in. That's a zone we want to spend a lot of time in. But in order to spend our time there, we have to also be able to resource and get back to our comfort zone when we need to. And then, of course, the overwhelm zone is where we just don't feel well. We're agitated or spaced out entirely, and it's no longer healthy for us to try to push ourselves. Sometimes we end up in that zone and we have to keep going, and that's just how life is. But we've got to be aware of the dynamics of this diagram. Those being that, again, we feel happy in that comfort zone. We get out of that learning zone, we start to feel less happy. I think a lot of times we don't really know the difference between our learning zone and our overwhelm zone. And when we get into that zone where we're actually growing, we feel like we need to leave it and get back to our comfort zone quickly, because so much of our habit is built around comfort and avoiding suffering rather than the causes of suffering. But we spend some time in that learning zone, and as we're in that learning zone, it grows, it gets bigger. We get more of a safe space to challenge ourselves and grow. Thinking of it in terms of the Buddhist path, we become more able to share ourselves. We become more able to put effort and joy into practice, and to be present and helpful to others and supportive. But we also need to notice when it's time to get back in the comfort zone. So we'll spend some time in the learning zone. At some point, we recognize it's time to move back to the comfort zone, hopefully before we get to the overwhelm zone. That's what we're kind of looking for here, is we want to be aware so that we don't end up always going into that panic overwhelm zone before we go running back to the comfort zone. Ideally, we're just skillfully moving between the comfort zone and the learning zone with a lot of self-awareness. And so we get back into that learning zone, spend some time there again, or not. Now we may be able to train ourselves to be happy in that zone. And this, to me, is what this helped me understand a little bit about our teachers. I mean, there's such joy while they're working so hard, and in circumstances that are kind of all an improvisation. Usually things are, how these teaching weekends go. Like there's a lot going on, and a lot of things don't go as planned, and they keep giving joy and giving time and giving teachings. And so I think we can be confident that we can, by recognizing what the learning zone is and what it's doing, by recognizing we're in a zone where we're growing and challenging, even if it's a little uncomfortable, that's a good thing. If we think about the results of what's happening there, we can actually start to generate some joy about being in that zone. And I think probably all of us have some example of that we're already doing or have worked with in our life. Maybe it's exercise. If you're a fitness person, like, you may have gotten to the point where you really enjoy doing it. You really enjoy pushing yourself in that way. It could be creative practices like painting, or like for me, when I was playing a lot of music, it was practicing a lot. I initially didn't like practicing when I was in band in high school, but as I grew into a musician, it was something I really enjoyed. So that's an important piece, is kind of noticing that little discomfort and the resistance to it, and being able to recognize and transform that into some joy. And when we do that, then the comfort zone grows. So our comfort zone gets a little bigger. Meanwhile, that overwhelm zone is getting smaller. There's less of this. Wow, I haven't thought about this as a mandala before. And that's probably not accurate. I'll have to think about that one. But this spaciousness of this diagram, there's less of that space where we're going to get panicked or overwhelmed. But we have to keep moving back to the comfort zone when we need it. So there's this process, this alternation. And eventually there's very little of that overwhelm zone there. But what tends to happen when we do that is we go back to that comfort zone, and it's so big and so spacious that we just want to explore it all. So we do this comfortable thing, and then we go over here and do that comfortable thing. And then we're comfortable over here again. And meanwhile, we're not getting into the learning zone. We're just in this comfort zone. and we're hanging out. Seems great. We don't really notice that that comfort zone and that learning zone are now shrinking because we're not spending time there. We're just spending time in this comfort zone, and counterintuitively, that makes it shrink. So this process is happening outside. We're not even really seeing it. And then at some point, maybe we're doing a thing we've done for 4 days for comfort, and it's been wonderful for 4 days, maybe a little bit less comfortable each day. And one day we're like, wait a minute, what? This was great when I did it the last 5 days. Why is it not making me feel good anymore? This is why that zone of comfort is shrinking, and we end up with this tiny little zone where we can actually get comfortable again. So we have to go back out of that learning zone again, and so much of what we encounter will now be panic zone too, an overwhelm zone. So this has resonated tremendously with me, and I'm trying to really integrate it. We talked last time about how, by the way, this is all on the last talk, which is on YouTube. So if it feels like I'm flying through this, you can definitely go back and watch the previous talk. Okay. So we also have the window of tolerance can be superimposed over this learning zone. And what I think we can take away from this is recognizing that overwhelm doesn't always feel like agitation. Like that sense of speediness and agitation isn't always what overwhelm feels like. Overwhelm can be like maximum spaced out kind of feeling, or dullness, or just kind of like feeling like there's absolutely nothing on your mind. You know, that sometimes is what overwhelm looks like too. Also, we can see that the window of tolerance is at least largely learning zone. And the takeaway here is that, yes, it's good to establish some balance, but we're never, if you think of like a teeter-totter, like well, I guess that's a bad example because it always sits one way or the other at the playground, but it's always kind of, it could go either way, like there's always a process of balancing with something that's, balanced. So I like the analogy of leaning back in a chair, on the back legs of a chair, and trying to stay with just 2 legs on the ground. It's always some adjustment that needs to be made. And so even if we're feeling agitated, but it's not outside that window, we could be in a really good place to be learning and growing. Similarly, if we're starting to get a little dull, a little sleepy, things like that, that's maybe still fine as a place for us to be challenged and grow. So this is really a process. I mean, I find this diagram very interesting, and that intellectually is where I started to get into this, but it's been in trying to remember it throughout the day and apply it, that like all of the teachings, this is where the work really happens and where the understanding really starts to happen. So the broad invitation here again is to, pay attention to ourselves a little bit here. And I think that is how we help other people. We have to kind of start there and trust our inner wisdom a bit. And I think the last thing we talked about last time I called working the edges of the donut. So, and that was really getting used to what it feels like to move from one zone to the other. So the learning zone being where we kind of want to spend our time. Mm-hmm. We need to really get good at noticing when we enter that zone. And what I mean by that is like, if we start to feel like this is a bad thing I shouldn't be doing, but all it is we've entered our learning zone, we need to recognize that and kind of correct ourselves. Oh no, this is not a big deal. I'm safe. I can keep doing this. And in fact, that's what I want to do, because the results I want, are more stability, more clarity, Buddhahood, Similarly, we want to know right when we get over that line to the overwhelm zone, because so often we don't notice that either. And then we spend way too much time in the red. So the questions we talked about last time were thinking of some ways when you've entered the learning zone, some of the signs in yourself that you've moved from the comfort zone to the learning zone. We also talked about how do you know when you've left the learning zone and gone into the overwhelm zone? And these are really specific personal questions. What happens for you when these things happen? And then of course, we were moving through all the zones in a way. Now we also know like what resources do we have to get back to our comfort zone? So these are the three questions that I would really encourage contemplating. Before I throw anything new at you, which is where we're going next, any thoughts or comments about all this?
The learning zone seems like an opportunity. It just because I was just reflecting on the day I had at work, and I'm dealing with annoying subcontractors and a particularly annoying vendor. And I was saying, well, yeah, at least I managed to be patient with them. And it's kind of like in talking about this, I realized I was in the learning zone. And one of the reward is that, yeah, I was successful at exercising patience. So it kind of seems to me like the learning zone there's a benefit to it in that it's a particular opportunity to exercise patience or other meritorious acts, and hopefully gain some merit from it.
Absolutely. And some habituation and some awareness too. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's a lot of benefits for sure. I appreciate you sharing that, because those personal experiences of this that really start to lock it in.
Yeah, it's not just it's beyond. I managed to keep from telling these people or expressing how annoyed I was or saying something else, something at all angry. It's like, oh, well, no, wait, you did good.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and that in itself, realizing that particular realization felt to me like learning.
Yeah. And I want to just call out too,
Oops.
something good that happened in general, and also about that situation, because I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the negative things that happened or the bad things that happened. And I think that there's a practice that you did that's really good, which is just taking the time to say, boy, that was good that happened, and here's why it happened,
Mm-hmm.
and making that connection explicit for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else before we move on a little bit?
Nope.
All right. So, by the way, a lot of what I'm sharing today, I completed a trauma-sensitive mindfulness certification this summer, which was a 36-hour course presented by David Trelevin, who literally wrote the book on trauma-sensitive mindfulness.
What did you say it is? Trauma?
Yeah, trauma-sensitive mindfulness.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
Okay.
There's a whole other conversation that we'll have at some time, because another thing I've been doing lately is digging deeply into the adverse effects of meditation, learning a lot about that, and I'm kind of talking about that now indirectly, because I'm giving ways of, really kind of taking care of ourselves and self-assessing.
What is it?
But the adverse effects of meditation,
Oh, okay.
there's a growing body of or a growing field of research into that. And that's something I've been looking into a little bit too.
Yeah.
One thing I'll just share something very briefly about that, because I thought it was interesting. The most common, and I've already talked quickly, just after I learned this, I mentioned it to like a handful of people and found people who had this experience. So maybe this will be useful for anyone here. And if you want to follow up about it afterwards, privately, we can. But the most common adverse effect is fear and terror. Sometimes even non-referential, like no real particular reason, or anxiety,
Yeah.
So the reason for that is kind of elementary, which is that when we are scared by something, our attention becomes very honed and specific and clear. And so when we spend a lot of time training attention, it's possible that the body can then say, what's going on? What's wrong? And all of a sudden, the physiological side of fear kicks in because of the attention we're training, because so often those go together naturally when there's actually something to be afraid of. So that's another reason why that's another good reason to do that interocepting, exterocepting kind of exercise too, and tracking the window of tolerance. There are times or situations, keeping in mind that everything's impermanent and always changing. Sometimes we need to do a different practice. Maybe that's just not the day to do a certain practice that we normally do. And we have to make a balance there between instructions to always do a practice every day. There are situations where, everything can be contraindicated under various circumstances. So just something to think about. That's a whole other tangent of stuff, but really broadly what we're talking about here is this resilience and resourcing. So how can we toughen up and also take care of ourselves, or take care of ourselves and still toughen up and move up forward on the path? So the main thing I want to teach today or share is this idea of mindful gauges. And this is something that was developed by Babette Rothschild, who wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is one of the main books about trauma. And then also taught by David Chalevin in that course that I took. And this is really amazing because this is a way to utilize the attention that we've been training to make decisions, more careful and skillful decisions. And a lot about this stuff for me has really been so supportive of the Vajrayana practice we do. Like this is really, to me, this really like connects with that idea of bringing everything to the path, So what we're talking about here is being aware of thoughts, physical sensations, behavior, emotions, and mental images. And we can think about this in terms of, like, a good example of this is, how do you know when it's time to have a meal? So maybe we have a thought, it's lunchtime, so we go get something to eat. Could be like our tummy starts to grumble. That would be like a physical gauge that it's time to eat. Could be some kind of behavior, walking past the fridge cues us that it's time to eat. Could be a case of the hangries. Or some irritability or something, tells us, oh, I haven't eaten in a while, it's time to eat. Or it could be a mental image. It's just a picture of something appears in our head, picture of pizza. So we need to be aware that we're always using gauges like this, but our process is often unconscious. So I'm kind of jokingly put mindless gauges, because we're obviously having these things happen all the time, but we so infrequently are aware, or to put it, the word Buddha means awake. So it's rare that we're actually awake to these things. And that's part of what I'm presenting here is methods of becoming awake to these processes, which is another way of saying learning our karma.
Mm-hmm.
So we can train in using our gauges mindfully with mindful gauges. And so I'll give a sort of a guided meditation here. This is a real guided meditation. Who am I kidding? So we'll take a meditative posture, not too tight, not too loose. And I'm going to put back on the screen the gauges we talked about. And first thing to know is everybody's a little different. So we'll take a little bit longer than you probably would in real life to do this right now. Maybe not. But the idea being that you can try each of these. And really what I mean is observe particularly those things. Or another way to say it, what we're gonna do is think of a scenario and observe what happens in our body in any of those gauges: thoughts, physical sensations, behavior, emotions, mental images. So this is really a practice of open awareness in a way. Like, we're not trying to put our attention on a specific thing. We're watching for what happens when we encounter a situation. So let's take a couple deep breaths in and out. And I just want you to bring to mind the idea of having a hot drink, something that's warm. Noticing whatever comes up, whether it's a thought, a sensation, behavior, emotion, or mental image. And then we'll switch it up and imagine having something cold to drink. Okay. Now we might have known or thought we knew right before we started that which of those two we would have picked. But now we maybe know why, or if that choice is arising from where we are in this moment and how we're actually feeling in this moment, other than habit, or reaction to something that isn't us, in the moment. So that's really what we're doing here is there's this process, and I'll go into a little bit more detail here, but we're trying options. And I think this is really important for a number of reasons. The first is this gets us thinking about the fact that we have options. I mean, that alone is something we forget, a lot of the time. I mean, we're so used to doing the same stuff that a lot of times we don't even take a moment to think, what are my options here? So that's one good thing. The other thing is that we're actually seeing how our self reacts, our self in the quotes, reacts to these ideas. We get to sort of run a simulation of our choices and check in and see how we feel. So the process here is first to pause and just be present. And that really is just pausing for a moment. And then gathering is imagining a couple scenarios and gathering the information, what your gauges are telling you. And the last step is to assess. So before we were just collecting, and this last step is to take that information and decide which path we want to take. And this can be any number of things. We'll do another one here in a moment before we stop, but this could be any kind of decision, but I think maybe most importantly, it could be decisions about our practice. One thing I've seen a lot in our tradition, and particularly the Tibetan Buddhist tradition with the emphasis on bodhicitta and Lojong teachings, is that we maybe lean too hard into the bodhisattva side of it. Like, of course, we are Buddha now, but we're also confused and limited. And those two things have to meet in the middle somewhere. But I think for a lot of us, we're maybe push ourselves too hard or overextend ourselves, inadvertently get into that overwhelm zone when we were really just trying to learn. So this can be a really good guide even with our practice and what we think we need or should do. Should's a dangerous word, right? So this is a way to check that stuff. So let's try another quick scenario here. So using these 3 steps of pause, gather, and assess. So first we'll just pause. And then think of 2 options for your breakfast tomorrow. And run each scenario for a moment, gathering information from your gauges. And then using that information, you can make a decision. Okay. So a couple points here to remember. Gauges are dynamic. So we are changing, the world is changing around us, other people are changing. So we need to be aware in every moment, as aware as we are the first time we try this. We're really trying to see where we're at in that moment. So that said, you probably will find certain gauges that are easier for you, that maybe are the ones that you go to more often. I've noticed for me, it's like the upper back and the shoulders a lot of time, like they start to tighten up and move upwards. When I start to get a little uncomfortable with something, I notice my chest sort of opens up and feels really light when something feels good or nourishing. So there's an element of this that this is a word I never really thought about until very recently, but embodied. This is like embodied practice. We're really checking in with our inner wisdom and including all of our experience, not just the thoughts, but the physical, into our experience in a skillful way, being aware and utilizing it in a smart way. Second thing to remember is, just like with meditation, we need to start with neutral. I thought I said neural for a minute. Yeah, neutral choices. So choices that are not too heavy duty. I mean, again, about that story about building the bathroom, right? Like, we're going to probably need this for some difficult decision down the road, but let's make sure to start out with simple choices like we did today. Remember that this is going to take some time, so we need to be patient. It takes a while sometimes just to even begin to notice. It definitely has developed for me since I first started doing this. Like, it took me a while to really kind of notice anything else besides one thing changing. There's like one kind of whatever the biggest, most obvious thing is. For a while, that was all I caught. But now I'm getting to where I can see several things sometimes and kind of have more information to gather. And the last thing is experiment and stay curious. I mean, that's kind of great advice for anything on the path. Just keep trying different methods, different things, and remain curious, because part of what I was reading in that Altered Traits book last night, they were talking about returning attention to the anchor, and how what happens when we do a thing again and again is we become less and less mindful. And they use the example of like people who have to watch like radar or something, where like most of the time it's empty and you're just watching for that time where something shows up, and that's like one of the hardest jobs, because it's the same thing over and over and over, but you need to be as aware in every moment. So staying curious is an important thing to do. And before we open it up to conversation, I just want to quickly tell the story about my retreat mate, Gelik Namgyal. And I want to tell the story because he inspired me then during the retreat, and he has just even in this week really, really been inspiring me. And so I just would like to share his smiling face with all of you briefly. He passed away about a year into our retreat. He was from Tibet, grew up in Tibet. I'm trying to remember. I need to check on this story. I think his parents were either taken or killed by the Chinese. I know he was put in prison by the Chinese with one of his siblings and spent a long time there. I think maybe, yeah, definitely years. And somehow got out, came back, and he was the first person I met when I came into the 3-year retreat, and he was my neighbor in the retreat house and the next door down. And just really kind of quiet, smiley, funny, playful, super devoted. And I remember we went for our 3-year retreat empowerments with Taisitu Rinpoche at Wappingers Falls. And one of Taisitu Rinpoche's attendants came up to one of my retreat brothers and said, "Do you know who that is?" Talking about Gelik. And all of those guys knew who Gelik was. And the reason they knew is because when he came to the US, he had an apartment and his phone number was just handed out to any Tibetans who were coming to the US. And they would call him from the airport and say, "Can I have a place to stay?" And he would go pick them up and they would stay at his house. And I guess it was so many people that they had to sleep in shifts because there just wasn't even enough room, but he would always go and pick people up and take them in. And so, I mean,
Wow.
he was amazing. And the reason why, in particular, why I'm thinking of him now is because I had forgotten for a couple of years the main thing and maybe the most important thing he taught me, which is I've said how devoted he was. And he and Rinpoche had a very special connection. When Rinpoche would come to see us, they were very cute together. And anyway, he so devoted, would be up in the morning. You know, we would go from 4 in the morning until 9:30 at night. When I would get up to get ready for the 4 o'clock, he was already up chanting mantra. And when I would go to bed at night, he would be chanting mantra. So he was on. I mean, he was there to devote his life to that retreat. It was the highlight of his life, and he was so devoted. At the same time, he would vacuum during the session. You know, I'd be in my room meditating during our session, and I'd hear when he just had decided at that moment to vacuum his meditation box. You know, or we're not supposed to leave our rooms. He would just go wandering off. You know, maybe I'd go down to use the bathroom. He'd be having a snack. You know, and like I remember, like honestly, me being a very judgy, especially at that point, like I was not a fan of that in the moment, especially the vacuuming, right? But I think I really, after he passed, actually, I think is when I realized, because I just realized how embodied he was in his practice and how connected to his own wisdom and devotion to the lineage and the practices. And to me, like, that is an embodied practitioner. I mean, that is a bodhisattva. He was almost like a Mahasiddha, right? Like he was ready to do whatever in the moment he needed. And I'm sure as he was having that snack or vacuuming that meditation box, he was present and saying mantra and, you know, aspiring for the benefit of beings. I have no doubt about that. But I love that he was this perfect mix of piousness and, like, you know, whatever, you know, there's an aspect of pure devotion and doing it in a, you know, the prescribed way. And then there was also this totally improvisational wild card, you know, whatever he felt in the moment kind of thing. And to me, like, that's what it's all about. Like, I feel like that is where it's at. So I hope that was a helpful kind of capper. And any thoughts or conversation?
So the practice,
What'd you
this
say?
practice, oh yeah. So this practice, you do it like throughout the day, it kind of like a way of looking to see what your mind is Yeah. Okay. I like
Yeah,
it.
like I would say at decision points, you know,
Yeah.
and we're talking really about very simple decision points.
Okay.
So
I
this would
like it.
not be like, just to be clear, like I'm not saying like, well, I'm not saying this either. I was going to say, I'm not saying like this should be your new practice and just do this on the cushion all the time. This is like an applied kind of throughout the day practice. But why you can use it on the cushion is you may want to do like what we did at the beginning and check
Mhm.
in and see internal, external, you know, where am I at today? What would support me right now? How can I challenge myself in the most productive way right now? Yeah. And finding all those mundane choices, you
Right.
know,
Yeah.
anything mundane.
Usually you don't think of them. You just do. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna try it.
Yeah. I mean, I honestly like that's kind of all this other stuff is great, like the pause, gather, all that, but really just the practice of like, you know, collecting options, that's radical for most of
Yeah.
us, you know.
Well, most of us are kind of, I think, in our head too much. I've heard lamas say that like almost all Westerners, especially Americans, have lung disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Too much mental activity, not being in the body, not tuning into the body or being grounded, just constant rush of thoughts.
Yes.
Like too many thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and this there's a macro and a micro conversation here too, because like we could choose to put our attention in another place, or we could choose to even, it's a choice to even look at what our mind's doing, you know.
Yeah.
Is it racing or is it dull, you know, like even just that is those are options we don't generally remember even if we know.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
So
And by
that, I
looking
mean,
at,
really this, go ahead, Lisa.
no, you first. Sorry.
I was just going to say, like, this is also like another way of habituating to being awake, you know, just a
Hmm.
way of plugging in a very useful way, moment to moment, more wokefulness. Sorry, maybe that's a bad word to use now, but you know what I mean?
Oh, I like it.
Silly. Me, I like it too. Good.
I know.
But yeah, we want to be awake. That's really what it is. Who wants to be asleep? We tried that. Not great.
True.
By the way, I once heard Gabor Mate, the renowned psychotherapist, he said the gateway drug is trauma.
Interesting. What do you think that means?
I think what it means is when he has clients that are addicts, he always undercovers an underlying trauma to the addiction.
Mm,
Well, maybe what he said was trauma is the gateway to drugs.
mm. I thought, because what my first take was that, um, because I feel like, for instance, most of us come to spiritual path from the overwhelm zone. You know, like it's usually
Oh,
something has
yeah,
happened, and
true.
that's what brings us, you know.
It did me.
So,
I mean, I had a nervous breakdown in 1991 and my life was horrible, but I started to see auras and I could feel what people were thinking. And I went from someone who was just purely realist, materialist to getting interested in all kinds of spirituality. But
wow.
I always said it was like the universe had to hit me over the head with a 2x4 to get me to wake up a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. There's got to be, I mean, I suppose there's situations of people coming to spiritual path from the comfort zone, but most people I've met, it's something, you know,
Yeah,
overwhelming.
yeah.
And it's seeking comfort, you know. I mean, like we want comfort in that moment. And I think again, like that comfort zone shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and maybe the only thing left in that little tiny shrunken dot is the path. You know, after a while, maybe that's the only thing left that we can go to.
the Dalai Lama's Path to Happiness. That was the book that got me.
Yeah. Oh, I
Yeah.
keep that's on my aspiration shelf over here.
Oh
But
yeah, it was like yeah, because I didn't know anything about it. And then I had a friend who taught me. He was a Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist, and he started like telling me small things about it, and then told me about Daniel's group.
yeah. What, like a group previous to this or this group?
Just this group I started here at Santa
Cool.
Monica KTC. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, any other thoughts or questions about any of this before we dedicate? This is, like I said, this has been really meaningful for me to start to go through this stuff. And I really, it's funny. I think I've mentioned this before, but there's times where I feel like a little weird, like sharing stuff that is from an author rather than like a lineage master or something. But to me, it's really like the pure meaning of Dharma is truth and the way things work. And the Dalai Lama has said, if science proves something, then Buddhism will change. And these kind of things that we talked about today, while they may not directly explicitly come through the Kagyu lineage, I think they're fully in accord with everything that we learn. And that's my opinion. And I think that in fact they're, for me, they've been an incredible way of embodying these practices and bringing them into daily life. And again, that's why I said like my faith in and awe in the Vajrayana has grown through being able to connect with this wisdom in these ways. And really, like, it's just awareness. Like, we're just cultivating awareness in corners that we haven't lit up before. But those corners are our own wisdom,
Yeah.
So let's put it to work.
One other thing, I took a course in nonviolent communication
Yeah.
a while back, and I saw part of it as being really dharmic because, as an example, after coming home from the training, Pamela told me about something that a friend of hers for 15 years had done. And normally I would have said, like how bizarre or, what a bitch that person was or something. But instead I said, oh, I wonder what their needs are. Like, what is the need that that person is trying to communicate? So it was, to me, so much dharmic to try to have empathy for someone. Like, wow, I wonder what they need, come from a place of curiosity rather than just saying, oh, well, they're just creating bad karma by doing that. Oh, well, they're wrong. You know what I mean? It was really fascinating.
Yeah. That's it. I had a conversation yesterday with a director of global programs at Denison. So they handle all of the like study abroad things. And I'd done one session with a group that had just come back, and it was fascinating for me to be working with students who just came back from an experience like that, because it reminded me of coming out of retreat, because they're in this re-entry mode, and they're feeling like they've kind of got their feet in two worlds, and maybe feeling like they've lost something, like, and maybe that something was the way they were in this different environment, or the things that the habits or feelings that different environment brought out of them. And now they're here back at home or Denison, and no one there had that experience. And so it's really neat to connect with people in that way. And all a little digression, but like the what I was trying to say is that the director and I told her a little bit about the Four Noble Truths, because I thought like attachment is an important thing to talk about with those students. But I also said how I think the first 3 steps of nonviolent communication would be some stuff to dive into with people who are going to travel overseas, particularly Americans, because we hear how awful Americans are as they go into other cultures and take their Americanness and try to, throw it all over wherever they are. But yeah, I mean, I think that idea of being able to make an observation and not a judgment, whatever new culture or food or whatever you're meeting, and to be able to recognize your feelings in the moment, and and take responsibility for them. And then to be able to see what needs of your own are bringing up those feelings. Like, to me, that sounds like great international travel prep, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so fun. These are all the avenues I'm getting to play with, and it's great. Like, sometimes I do 3 totally different things in the same day, and I'll be at global programs. I was at an entrepreneurship summit this morning doing a session for them. So it's like just all this really cool stuff. So
Nice.
just want to share all that joy with you because I'm feeling good about it.
Good.
Great. Very cool. Spreading Dharma.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's wild.
that's awesome.
Well, let's dedicate the merit together of our time. I'm really grateful to have spent this time with you, and I appreciate you letting me share what I've been working on. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. So
All right.
we'll dedicate the merit. By this merit, may all beings obtain the omniscience of Buddhahood and defeat our common enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, may we free all beings. The courageous Manjushri, who knows everything as it is, the Mantabhadra, who also knows in the same way, and also all the Bodhisattvas, that I may follow in their path, I completely dedicate all this virtue. Thank you.
Thank you, Lama Adam.
Thank you. Take care. I'll see you soon.
Everybody, good night.
Yes.
Good night, guys.
Good night, everyone.
Night.